It was one of those evenings that linger in your memory, not because anything spectacular happened, but because of the way time seemed to stretch around a single moment. I was leaning against the edge of the bar at the hotel lounge, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee, when she appeared like a sudden gust of wind, disheveled, bright-eyed, and entirely out of place in the polished crowd. Rebecca. I had seen her once or twice before at mutual friends gathering, the kind of person who blends into the edges of a room until something jolts her forward. Tonight, something had. She slid into the seat beside me without asking, a hesitant confidence in her. I caught the quick exhale that escaped her, a breath that hinted at both anxiety and defiance. "Nathan," she said, not looking at me at first, as if she needed to focus on the floor tiles to steady herself. "I have a proposition." I raised an eyebrow, letting the word hang between us. Her hands fiddled with the strap of her purse, twisting and untwisting it. There was a fragile urgency in her gestures, an almost imperceptible tremor. I waited. She was pacing herself, measuring every syllable before speaking. Finally, she looked at me, eyes darting with a mixture of mischief and desperation. It's only for appearances, just pretending. Nothing serious. We act like a couple, just for a little while." I blinked. I didn't reach for a witty remark. I didn't chuckle. Instead, I let my calm settle around her like a quiet invitation. "I'd love that," I said, "not just pretending." There was no pressure in my voice, no expectation, only a statement. She looked up, startled, her mouth opening slightly, then closing again, as if the sound of someone accepting her on her own terms was foreign. We sat together, shoulders brushing slightly, in a room full of strangers whose laughter and chatter seemed impossibly loud. She explained, in halting fragments, that she couldn't face a family gathering alone. Old tensions, whispered criticism, expectations she didn't feel prepared to meet. There was no melodrama in her tone, only a raw, quiet vulnerability that drew my attention without effort. I nodded, listened, and offered my presence like a steady anchor. There was no need for grand declarations, no rush to intimacy, just the simple acknowledgement that she wouldn't be alone tonight. When the first guest approached, I draped my arm lightly over her chair, a silent signal that she was accounted for. Rebecca's shoulders relaxed fractionally, the tight line around her jaw easing as she realized she wasn't expected to navigate the evening by herself. I kept my eyes on the room but remained attuned to her shifts, the slight tilt of her head, the way she leaned in when a familiar face approached. My presence was quiet, protective, unobtrusive, but unmistakable. By the time the first toast was made, she was smiling, small and genuine, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but was closer than it had been moments ago. And in that brief, flickering connection, no words needed, something subtle had, not love, not yet, but a recognition that we were no longer entirely separate, that we had, willingly, started to carve a shared space in the midst of the crowd. Something like a promise had been, even if neither of us knew the shape it would take. The morning after, I found myself awake earlier than usual, replaying the previous evening like a quiet film. Rebecca's words lingered in my mind, unhurried and deliberate. "It's just pretending. Nothing serious." The way she said it, with her lips pressed just slightly together and her eyes flicking toward the window, suggested that it was more than a simple social maneuver. It was a lifeline she was tentatively tossing into the air, hoping someone would catch it, and I had. We met at a small cafe near her apartment, the kind of place where the light comes in at odd angles, painting everything in muted gold. She arrived a few minutes late, apologizing quietly, her voice carrying that subtle tension she rarely let show. I smiled at her without comment, gesturing toward the empty chair across from me. She hesitated, then sat, settling her bag in her lap like a shield, as if wary of exposing too much. "I don't usually do this," she admitted, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The words were soft, almost swallowed by the ambient noise, but deliberate in their uncertainty. She meant the entire arrangement, asking someone to step into the role of a partner, even superficially. I nodded. "Neither do I said. "But sometimes, agreeing to something unexpected is better than standing alone. No grand gestures, no overpromising, just a statement of presence." That seemed to put her slightly. Her shoulders uncoiled fractionally, and I could see the first flicker of genuine trust, however tentative. We spent the next hour discussing boundaries, small agreements about gestures, and explanations to anyone who might ask. She explained the reason, a family event looming, a reunion she didn't want to face alone. Not because she was afraid of her family, exactly, but because she knew the questions, the glances, the assumptions would press too close if she went without someone by her side. She didn't demand anything from me beyond presence. No declarations, no urgency, just accompaniment, the simplest form of loyalty. I found myself noticing things beyond words, the slight tremor when she reached for her cup, the quick inhale before she laughed at a remark she was trying to disguise, the way she studied the patterns on the tablecloth as if grounding herself, and I felt a quiet resolve settle over me, a decision to remain calm, to match her pace, to provide steadiness without intrusion. When she glanced up and caught my eye, she seemed surprised, almost startled by the steadiness she found there. "You really don't mind?" she asked, the question almost childlike in its simplicity. I shook my head. "I mind nothing," I said. "We do this together, whatever comes." She smiled then, a small curve that felt fragile and honest, and in that instant, I sensed the first true weight of choice passing between us. The evening was still hours away, and yet, something fundamental had already shifted. She had allowed someone to walk beside her, and I had chosen to do it without hesitation. The day of the family gathering arrived with a muted sort of tension. I followed Rebecca to the house, keeping a careful pace behind her, aware of the subtle tremor in her steps. She moved like someone threading a fragile line between composure and uncertainty. Her apartment had been quiet earlier that morning, the usual traces of her life laid out in calm disarray, books stacked unevenly, a half-empty coffee mug, a scarf draped over the back of a chair. I hadn't needed an invitation to notice. Some details reveal more about a person than any words ever could. We arrived, and she paused at the threshold, taking a measured breath. Her hand brushed mine. Not a demand, not a plea, just a fleeting contact, a quiet acknowledgement that I was there. I offered a nod, an assurance, and she smiled, small and hesitant, before stepping inside. The air was filled with distant chatter and laughter that felt almost too loud, too bright. I kept my presence steady, following her cues, anticipating moments when her confidence might falter. At the first approach of a relative, I leaned slightly, offering a simple introduction. "Rebecca and I have been friends a long time." It wasn't flashy, didn't overstate our connection, but it was enough to anchor her. I noticed how her shoulders eased as we navigated her fingers brushing the fabric of her dress when she laughed nervously at a comment from her cousin. It was in these quiet, almost imperceptible movements that I understood the real weight of her discomfort, and how much she needed someone beside her who would neither crowd nor abandon her. We found a corner to linger, where the hubbub thinned. I allowed her space to talk or remain silent, answering questions with minimal intrusion but sufficient clarity. She glanced at me once, and in that moment a faint light passed over her expression, a recognition that she was not alone. She exhaled slowly, a release that was almost imperceptible, yet it carried with it a sense of relief. My presence had become a kind of quiet permission for her to relax, to breathe. As the evening progressed, I noticed her tuning into me in ways she hadn't before. Subtle eye contact, fleeting smiles, gestures of attention that hinted at trust. We shared small, wordless signals, an adjusted chair, a protective hand hovering near hers during introductions, a soft nod that reassured without speaking. There was no need for grand declaration. Intimacy can thrive in the spaces between words, in silences that speak louder than conversation. By the time we were ready to leave, the tension had softened, and Rebecca's composure appeared more natural, more her own. The drive home was quiet, punctuated only by the occasional glance, the faint brush of her hand against mine. I didn't speak of the evening, and she didn't need me to. Something unspoken had been established, a shared space, a mutual recognition of safety, and the subtle, undeniable sense that we were beginning something neither of us had anticipated, but both were willing to explore. We met the next afternoon for a walk along the river, the kind of crisp winter sunlight that made shadows long and soft. Rebecca arrived in her coat pulled tight around her, scarf loosely knotted, and an expression that balanced between curiosity and apprehension. I had expected her to be cautious, but the way she scanned the path ahead suggested she was measuring something beyond the terrain. I fell into step beside her, silent at first, letting the rhythm of our footsteps match hers. She spoke first, her voice low, almost hesitant. "I don't usually talk about things like this." Her hands stayed tucked in her pockets, fingers brushing against the wool. I nodded, encouraging without interrupting, offering space for her to fill in the gaps on her. "Then don't. Not unless you want to." She looked at me, eyes flickering with surprise, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of relief, someone acknowledging her boundaries without judgment. We talked about simpler books we'd recently read, the music that clung to certain moments in our past, the way the wind carried scents of distant streets. Conversation flowed unevenly, halting and tentative, but it felt authentic, unforced. And in the pauses, in the silences that stretched between words, a subtle intimacy began to form. I noticed the way her gaze softened when she realized I wasn't pressing for more, how her hand relaxed from its defensive posture, and how a small, almost imperceptible smile emerged when a shared observation made her laugh quietly. Her vulnerabilities surfaced gradually. She admitted, cautiously, The fear of becoming dependent on someone again, of being hurt in ways she couldn't control. I listened without interjecting, letting her set the pace, letting the space between us carry the weight of understanding. I realized then that presence could be as powerful as just being there, steady and unshakable, provided a sense of security that no assurances could replicate. At one point, she paused and leaned against the railing, eyes tracing the river's flow. "It's strange," she said, almost to herself. "I feel safer with you than I do with anyone else right now." I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence affirm the sentiment. My hand brushed briefly against hers, not as an intrusion, but as a gentle confirmation of solidarity. She didn't pull away. We continued walking, sharing small truths and quiet laughter, our pace unhurried, our connection deepening not through grand gestures but through the understated consistency of being side by side. By the time we returned to the streetlights that marked the end of the river path, I realized that something meaningful was forming, a bond born not from declarations or urgency, but from mutual respect, steady companionship, and the subtle courage it took for her to allow someone in. In her eyes, I saw a flicker of hope, and I knew that choosing to stay with her, without demanding more than she could give, was already changing everything. The next invitation came not as a social obligation, but as a quiet choice on her part. I had assumed our encounters would remain constrained by circumstance, by the edges of necessity. Yet, Rebecca asked me to join her without pretense, without the shield of a family event looming over. There was a subtle tremor in her voice when she spoke, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, and I recognized it as an unspoken challenge. Would I step forward simply because she asked? I accepted without hesitation. There was no need to weigh the pros and cons. The decision felt natural. She met me outside her apartment, bundled against the lingering winter chill, and I noticed the way she glanced at me before unlocking the door, a fleeting check for reassurance, an acknowledgement of trust she was offering. Inside, the apartment carried a quiet warmth, familiar, yet intimate. It was a space where she could lower her guard, and I intended to honor that unspoken agreement. We settled on the couch with a film she had picked, the kind of light-hearted story that required no emotional heavy lifting. The room was quiet except for the occasional lines of dialogue from the screen and the soft rustle of blankets. I observed her as she adjusted herself, tucking her legs beneath her, brushing stray strands of hair from her face, and laughing quietly at moments that genuinely amused her. She wasn't performing for me. She wasn't trying to impress. She was simply existing, and that was enough. Occasionally, our hands brushed, deliberately unplanned, and neither recoiled. There was no pressure, no expectation, only the recognition that proximity could be comfortable without demanding intimacy. She looked at me a few times, eyes lingering, searching perhaps for confirmation that she was free to be herself without judgment. I offered small gestures, adjusting a cushion near her back, passing her a cup of tea, listening to her comments about the film without interrupting. These moments, though minor, carried weight. They built a rhythm of care, subtle, yet undeniable, that neither of us had articulated. At one point, she sighed and rested her head briefly against my shoulder. It was tentative, almost testing the waters, yet there was no hesitation in my response. I shifted slightly to accommodate her, my hand resting lightly on the armrest between us, not pressing, not claiming, merely present. Her breath eased, and I felt the delicate balance of trust forming in that quiet, shared space. The evening unfolded without dramatics, without declaration. We shared food, laughter, and silence, each moment reinforcing a simple truth. Her choice to ask, my choice to remain, and the gentle weight of presence could become something profoundly meaningful. By the time the credits rolled on the film, the connection between us had deepened, not through urgency, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet decisions we had made for each other, unspoken, yet transformative. A few days passed, and Rebecca's sudden absence felt like the quiet space of a missing note in a melody I had begun to follow. She hadn't called, hadn't replied to a casual message, and yet I didn't reach out with insistence. There is a subtle power in presence, in waiting without pressure. I reminded myself that trust cannot be hurried. It must be earned repeatedly, in moments both small and profound. Then came the message, brief, almost clipped. "Still here," it read, and I understood instantly. She was testing the waters, reaching for reassurance without exposing vulnerability entirely. I replied simply, "Always." No punctuation, no flourish, just a promise, uncomplicated and steady. I waited, aware of the fragile tension that hovered behind her few words. When she returned, the air between us was tentative but unstrained. Her relief was palpable, visible in the way her shoulders sagged, in the small, unguarded laugh that escaped when she realized I had not left, had not withdrawn. There was no apology, no explanation. The absence itself had already spoken volumes. She needed space, and I had given it. Now, The return was a choice, and choices carry weight. We spent the day quietly, letting routines fill the gaps. A walk through a nearly empty park, the crunch of frost beneath the light wind lifting her hair in delicate waves. She spoke in fragments about her sudden withdrawal, about the fears she couldn't always. I listened, attentive, but unobtrusive, letting the cadence of her words guide my responses. At times, my hand brushed hers as we passed along a narrow path, a silent affirmation of steadiness and attention. Each gesture carried no urgency, only presence. Later, sitting on a worn bench, she leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, eyes tracing the pattern of the branches above. I didn't know if you'd wait, she admitted softly. The honesty was fragile, almost trembling, yet there was strength in it too. I shrugged lightly, a gesture of simplicity and calm. I'm not going anywhere, I said, letting my voice carry the quiet conviction that words alone could not She exhaled, a sound that seemed to release more than just tension, doubt, hesitation, the invisible weight of fear that had lingered. We didn't need to speak sitting side by side, observing the slow drift of the day. The connection that had been interrupted resumed itself naturally. She had returned of her own accord, and I had chosen to remain a constant in the quiet spaces of her uncertainty. The unspoken understanding between us deepened, shaping a rhythm neither rushed nor forced. In that steady return, a subtle transformation. What had been tentative became tangible, rooted in mutual choice and patient presence. The beginning of something neither of us could yet name, but both recognized as essential. The invitation came as an unexpected certainty. Rebecca had suggested a walk somewhere new, a place she said was quiet, away from everything. I didn't ask questions. I simply agreed. The choice to accompany her felt simple, yet beneath it, I understood the weight it. She was offering a piece of her world, a fragment of the life she trusted no one else with, and I accepted without hesitation. We walked through winding streets, the kind that curve around older buildings, revealing small gardens tucked between apartments, and the faint smell of baking bread drifting from unseen windows. She talked about the route, softly, as if testing its rhythm, revealing her favorite spots. A narrow bridge over a calm canal, a bench hidden beneath a canopy of bare trees, the way the light shifted when the sun hit the rooftops. Her voice carried a quiet pride in the familiarity, and I listened, attentive, savoring the way she measured every word. At the park, she led me to a bench that overlooked a small, frozen pond. The scene was serene, almost surreal in its simplicity, a place where the rush of the outside world seemed to pause. She sat first, letting her coat fall open slightly, exposing her hands folded in her lap. I settled beside her, leaving a space between us that felt respectful, yet inviting. She didn't speak immediately, only let the quiet settle around us. After a long moment, she exhaled and said softly, "It's peaceful here. I like coming alone sometimes, but it's better with someone you trust." Her words carried vulnerability, but also an honesty that didn't demand reciprocation, only acknowledgement. I nodded, offering a simple, steady presence. "I'm glad to be here," I said. No expectation, just fact. That small statement seemed enough. We watched the thin ice ripple where a slight wind brushed the surface. I could feel her body relax beside mine, the tension that usually clung to her shoulders softening as she leaned slightly toward me. It was a gesture of trust, unspoken and delicate. She began to speak quietly, about fears she didn't usually voice, about the strange weight of being alone too often, about the tiny victories that often went unnoticed. I listened, letting her words flow, occasionally responding with short, affirming nods or a quiet comment that acknowledged her without intruding. When the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the pond, she leaned back, head resting gently on the bench's edge. I shifted slightly, offering my shoulder as an unspoken support. She didn't lean on it fully, but the space between us contracted subtly, a silent agreement that this small moment was shared. In her eyes, I could see a flicker of relief, a recognition that someone had chosen to be present, to remain, without judgment, without expectation. And in that quiet, fleeting intimacy, a fragile, unmistakable bond began to take root, forming in silence what words could never capture. The day unfolded without plan or pretense. Rebecca had suggested meeting early, but she didn't outline any schedule. When I arrived, she was already at the cafe, tucked into a corner table, her coat draped loosely over the chair. She looked up, a small, almost hesitant smile playing on her lips, and for a moment, I simply watched her, noticed the way her fingers tapped the edge of the cup, the subtle way she shifted in her seat, the quiet depth of her gaze scanning the room without settling. We ordered nothing formal, just coffee and pastries, and then settled into a rhythm of conversation that was mostly unhurried. She spoke about books she had been reading, a recent visit to the market, trivialities that were anything but trivial. I listened carefully, interjecting only to affirm or clarify, never to dominate or The intimacy in our exchange was born not from grand declarations, but from a shared willingness to occupy the same space fully, without distraction or expectation. At one point, a customer brushed past, knocking her sleeve lightly. I reached instinctively, steadying her hand, and she gave a small, surprised laugh. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it marked a subtle acknowledgement. She was aware of my presence, and I of hers. There was no need for words to cement it. Presence, I realized, had a language all its own. As the morning stretched on, the conversation waned into silence, but the quiet between us was not empty. She leaned back, eyes half closed, allowing herself the rare luxury of not performing, of simply being. I watched, patient, my hand resting lightly near hers on the table without touching, a silent offer of support. It was in that small spatial negotiation that I felt the full weight of trust she had begun to place in me. Eventually, she spoke again, softly, almost unsurely. "It's strange. I feel like I can breathe here." I nodded, not out of habit, but with deliberate acknowledgement. "You can," I said. "You always can." No embellishment, no insistence, only the statement, steady and unwavering. She looked at me fully, eyes searching, and in them, I saw the relief of being understood without demand. Later, as we walked out onto the quiet streets, she kept close, not in fear, not in necessity, but in choice. Every gesture, every small alignment of movement spoke of a bond that had begun quietly, deliberately, and without spectacle. It was unspoken, yet undeniable. The trust between us had deepened into something tangible, something neither fleeting nor superficial. And in that slow, careful affirmation, I realized that the space we had begun to share had begun to define us, not merely as companions, but as a pair discovering a rhythm uniquely our own, without rush, without pressure, only the steady heartbeat of mutual regard and quiet understanding. We had planned nothing, as usual, allowing the day to unfold according to the whims of our own pace. Rebecca suggested a quiet afternoon at her apartment, a safe space she rarely offered to anyone. I arrived to find her standing by the window, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, gaze fixed on the street below. She turned as I entered, a faint, cautious smile greeting me, and I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The room was sunlight spilling across the floorboards and lighting the edges of scattered books and notebooks. Rebecca motioned for me to sit, and I chose a spot slightly across from her, leaving a deliberate space that invited her comfort without intrusion. She relaxed gradually, the tension in her shoulders dissipating as if measured by some invisible scale. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence with chatter. I simply watched her, attentive but unobtrusive, letting the unspoken rhythm of presence carry the conversation that did not need words. Eventually, she hesitated, then reached for a small envelope tucked among her papers. It was a letter from an ex, something old and folded with care, the edges slightly worn. She showed it to me not out of obligation, but as a quiet admission of vulnerability, a fragment of the past she no longer needed to defend. I took the envelope in my hands gently, examined it without comment, returning it afterward to her lap. I did not ask her to recount the content. She had already done enough by allowing me into that fragile space. "I didn't think I'd ever let anyone see this," she whispered, and her voice carried a tremor of honesty that made the quiet between us weighty, yet safe. I reached out, placing my hand lightly over hers. No words accompanied the gesture. None were necessary. In that brief contact, she felt understood, chosen, and protected, not because I had forced intimacy, but because I had offered presence. Her sigh, long and soft, carried the relief of release, as if letting go of the letter was only possible now that someone had borne witness. We spent the afternoon in the muted glow of the apartment, talking intermittently, reading, and occasionally sharing silence that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Every small action, handing her tea, adjusting the light blanket over her knees, a quiet nod at something she said, reinforced the unspoken bond. There was no urgency, no expectation of confession or reciprocity. And yet, by the time evening settled outside the window, something undeniable, a shared trust, an unspoken understanding that she could be herself, fully and without hesitation, and I would remain, steadfast and unintrusive. In that quiet, intimate orbit, I realized that the smallest gestures often carry the greatest weight. Her choice to share, my choice to listen without judgment, had shifted the balance between us. Something essential had begun, subtle, profound, and the world beyond the apartment faded, leaving only the delicate, unmistakable pulse of a bond quietly solidifying in the space between us. The family gathering arrived once more, and this time, Rebecca's invitation carried no pretense. She opened the door, eyes searching mine briefly, and the small curve of her lips suggested both anticipation and relief. I followed her inside, noting the subtle shift in her posture, less tension, more ease, as if the invisible weight of earlier expectations had lightened. Introductions came and went. She didn't explain, didn't justify our presence. It wasn't necessary. Our gestures spoke for us. The slight adjustment of her hair, my steady hand brushing the back of her coat, the way we navigated the room without stumbling over. Observers noticed only the quiet comfort that radiated between us. Nothing more. As the evening progressed, I watched her relax fully into the rhythm of the gathering. She laughed naturally, answered questions with genuine interest, and at moments, her eyes found mine across the room. Each glance held no urgency, no demand, only a subtle reassurance. We were present, together, and the bond between us required no validation from anyone else. Later, when the music softened and conversation thinned, we found ourselves in a corner, seated side by side. The space between us had narrowed not by force, but by choice. She leaned slightly toward me, and I let her, offering steadiness without claiming, presence without intrusion. It was a small alignment, a silent acknowledgement of the intimacy we had cultivated. As the night drew on, she spoke softly about how strange it felt to move through a room without the usual tension, the usual performance. I listened, offering nods and occasional remarks that reassured without directing. There was no dramatic confession, no sweeping declaration, only the quiet affirmation that she had been seen, that she had been chosen, and that my presence had never wavered. When it was time to leave, the city lights spilled across the pavement, painting long shadows behind us. We walked together in silence, side by side, each step deliberate and unhurried. There was a subtle shift in the rhythm of our movement, comfort without need, trust without pressure, intimacy without demand. We didn't speak of the future, nor did we need to. The choice to be together, the steady acknowledgement of presence, had transformed the ordinary into something quietly profound. As we reached the edge of her street, she paused, glanced at me, and smiled. That single, unspoken gesture carried everything: relief, trust, and the promise of continuity. Nothing had been forced, nothing had been dramatized, and yet, as we parted that evening, I understood that something essential had begun. A bond shaped by small choices, steady presence, and mutual recognition. Something real, something enduring, something that had started as pretend, but had quietly become undeniable.